Tonight, we travel back in time, not to a famous kingdom, not to a battlefield filled with soldiers, but to a quiet place that history almost forgot, a small village, hidden between two hills, where life moved slowly and the world outside seemed very far away. This village was called Eldermere. If you had walked there in the early 1700s, you would not have found castles or great markets. Instead, you would see wooden houses, narrow dirt paths, and fields of barley gently moving in the wind. The people who lived there were simple farmers. They woke with the sunrise, worked through the quiet day, and slept when darkness covered the valley. Nothing in Eldermere happened quickly. Even time itself seemed to move slower. But the strangest thing about the village was not its peaceful life. It was the road that led to it. A long, dusty road that disappeared into the hills. A road that once connected Eldermere to the wider world. And yet, by the year 1723, almost no one used it anymore. A village between the hills. Eldermere sat in a small valley surrounded by gentle green hills. A thin river flowed quietly along the edge of the village, providing water for crops and animals. The houses were built from dark wood and stone gathered from the nearby hills. Roofs were covered with thick straw that kept the rain out during long winters. Every morning the village slowly came to life. Roosters crowed. Doors creaked open. Smoke rose lazily from chimneys as families prepared simple breakfasts. Most meals were the same every day. Bread made from barley flour, warm milk from goats, and sometimes a small bowl of vegetable soup. Life here was not rich, but it was peaceful. Children played near the river while their parents worked in the fields. Elderly villagers sat outside their homes, watching clouds slowly move across the sky. To them, this quiet routine was normal. It had been the same for generations. The old road just beyond the last house in the village. The old road began. It was wide enough for carts and horses. But years of wind and rain had slowly worn it down. Grass had begun growing along its edges, and in some places, the path almost disappeared entirely. But the road had not always been like this. Long ago, it had been busy. Very busy. According to the oldest villagers. Merchants once traveled through Eldermere regularly. Carts filled with goods passed along the road. Silk, fabrics from distant lands, spices with strong and unfamiliar scents, tools made from shining metal. Travelers stopped in the village to rest. They shared stories about cities far away. Cities filled with tall stone buildings, crowded markets, and thousands of people. To the villagers of Eldermere, those stories sounded almost magical. But those days were long gone. One by one, the travelers stopped coming. No one knew exactly why. Perhaps new roads had been built elsewhere. Perhaps the trade routes had changed. Or perhaps the world had simply forgotten the valley. Whatever the reason, the road became quiet. Year after year, fewer carts appeared. Until eventually none came at all. Thomas Alder. In a small wooden house near the river lived a man named Thomas Alder. Thomas was in his early 30s. He was tall, quiet, and known in the village as someone who often asked unusual questions. Unlike many villagers, Thomas was curious about the world beyond the hills. As a child, he loved listening to stories from travelers. But by the time he grew older, those travelers were already gone. The road had grown silent. Still, Thomas sometimes walked along it in the evenings. Not very far, just enough to see the hills turning golden in the setting sun. Sometimes he wondered what lay beyond them. What cities might exist on the other side. What people might be living lives completely different from his own. But such thoughts were rare in Eldermere. Most villagers were content With what they knew, they had fields to care for, animals to feed, and families to protect. Out the outside world was something distant, almost like a story. A strange mark in the dust one afternoon in early autumn. Thomas was repairing a wooden fence near the edge of the village. The air was cool. Dry leaves drifted slowly across the road, while hammering a loose board back into place. Thomas noticed something unusual in the dirt path. At first he ignored it, but then he looked again. There was a mark in the dust, a deep curved line pressed into the ground. Thomas stepped closer. He knelt down. And slowly brushed some dirt away with his hand. It was a wheel. Track. Fresh. Not old, like the faded tracks that sometimes appeared after heavy rain. This one had been made recently, very recently. Thomas stood up and looked down the road. The path stretched quietly between the hills. No horses. No carts. No travelers. Just wind moving gently through tall grass. Still, the track was real. Something heavy had passed through the valley. The evening gathering. That evening, the villagers gathered in the small central square. This was a daily habit in Eldermere. People shared news about crops, weather, and small village matters. Thomas mentioned the wheel track. At first the villagers listened with curiosity, but soon many began shaking their heads. Old Marta, the village baker, spoke first. No carts travel that road anymore, she said calmly. Others agreed. Man suggested the mark could have been made by a fallen tree or broken cartwheel from years ago. Another laughed softly and said Thomas must have imagined it. But Thomas was certain the mark had been fresh. Too fresh to be old. Still, the villagers did not worry. Life in Eldermere had been quiet for so long that the idea of travelers returning felt almost impossible. Soon, the conversation returned to normal village topics. Harvest plans. Weather predictions. And repairs needed before winter. Yet Thomas could not stop thinking about the RO of a restless night. That night, Eldermere slowly fell asleep. Lanterns went dark when by. The river continued its soft and endless flow beside the village. Clouds drifted quietly across the moon, but Thomas remained awake. He sat near the window of his small house, looking toward the hills. Listening. Waiting. He did not know exactly why. Perhaps curiosity, perhaps a strange feeling he could not explain. Then, sometime after midnight, he heard something very faint, almost lost in the wind. A distant creaking sound. Slow. Rhythmic. Like wooden wheels turning along an old road. Thomas stood up quickly. He opened the door and stepped outside. Valley was silent. The hills stood dark against the moonlight. And the road lay empty, just as it always had. Yet Thomas was certain, for a brief moment, someone had been traveling through the valley. And if that was true, then Eldermere might not be as forgotten as everyone believed. Morning arrived quietly in Eldermere. Soft light slowly crept across the valley, touching the tops of the green hills before gently reaching the wooden rooftops of the village. For most of the villagers, the day began like every other. Roosters crowed, wooden doors opened, the smell of warm bread drifted through the air as old Marta prepared her daily batch in the small village bakery. But for Thomas Alder, the morning felt different. He had slept very little. Faint sound he heard during the night, the creaking of distant wooden wheels, remained clear in his mind. It had not sounded like the wind. It had not sounded like an animal. It had sounded exactly like a cart, traveling slowly along the old road, and that thought would not leave him. After a quick meal of bread and milk, Thomas stepped outside and began walking toward the edge of the village. Air was cool and calm. Thin clouds moved Lazily across the pale sky. The valley looked exactly as it always had. Peaceful. Silent. Unchanged. Yet Thomas felt certain something unusual had happened during the night. The road in morning light. When Thomas reached the old road, he paused for a moment. Morning sunlight stretched across the dusty path, revealing every small stone and crack in the ground. He walked slowly along the road, carefully examining the dirt. And then he saw them. More tracks. Not just one, several clear-cut impressions, pressed deeply into the earth. Wheel tracks, fresh ones. Same shape he had seen the day before, but now they continued farther down the road. Thomas followed them carefully. Each step brought a new sense of curiosity. The tracks moved steadily toward the hills. As if a cart had traveled through the valley sometime during the night. He crouched down again and studied the marks closely. The wheels had been larger than the simple farming carts used by villagers, and the marks were deep, suggesting the cart had carried something heavy. For a moment, Thomas simply stood there, staring at the quiet road. If a traveler had passed through Eldermere, why had no one seen them? Why had the cart not stopped in the village? Travelers always stopped before continuing through the hills. They needed food, water, or rest, but this traveler, whoever they were, had passed silently through the valley. Conversation with old Marta later that morning. Thomas visited the village bakery. The small building smelled warmly of bread and smoke. Marta stood behind a wooden table, dusting flour from her hands. She had lived in Eldermere longer than anyone else. If anyone remembered the old road clearly, it would be her. Thomas, she said calmly when he entered, you look tired. I did not sleep much, Thomas replied. He told her about the tracks he had found along the road. At first, Marta listened quietly, but when he mentioned hearing the cart during the night, she stopped kneading the dough. For a long moment, she said, nothing. Then she sighed slowly. Young men always believe. The world is full of mysteries, she said, gently, but sometimes roads are just roads. Still, there was something thoughtful in her expression. As if the idea of a traveler passing through Eldermere had stirred an old memory. My grandfather once told me stories about that road. She continued after a moment. Long before you or I were born, merchants traveled through this valley almost every week. Thomas leaned slightly closer. What happened to them? He asked. Marta shook her head slowly. No one really knows. Some say a new trade route opened farther east. Others say the old market town beyond the hills slowly disappeared. Her voice became softer, and some people believe something else entirely. Thomas waited, but Marta did not continue. Instead, she simply returned to preparing the bread. The forgotten market town. Later that afternoon, Thomas spoke with several other villagers. One of them was an elderly farmer named Gareth, who had spent his entire life in Eldermere. Gareth remembered hearing stories about a market town that once existed beyond the hills, a busy place where traders gathered from many different regions. Carts filled the streets. Gareth explained slowly while leaning on his wooden walking stick. You could buy tools, cloth, spices, almost anything, but that was long ago. What happened to the town? Thomas asked. Gareth shrugged. No one here knows for sure. Travelers stopped coming, and after that the story slowly faded. Thomas found this strange. A busy market town could not simply disappear without reason. Yet no one in Eldermere seemed to know what had happened. It was as if the entire road and everything connected to it had slowly vanished from memory. Following the tracks by late afternoon, Thomas returned to the road again. The wheel tracks were still visible in the dry earth, curving gently as they moved toward the hills. For a long time he stood there, Wondering how far the traveler had gone, then curiosity finally won. He decided to follow the tracks. Just a little farther than usual, the road slowly climbed upward. Between the hills, tall grass brushed softly against his legs as he walked. Birds moved quietly between tree branches. Above, after nearly half an hour of walking, Thomas noticed something else. Hoof prints, several of them. The traveler had been using horses to pull the cart, but something about the prints felt unusual. They were deeper than normal. Almost as if the horses had been struggling to pull a very heavy load. Thomas continued, walking. The valley behind him slowly disappeared from view as the hills grew steeper. He had never gone this far before. Most villagers rarely did, yet the tracks continued. And Thomas felt certain that somewhere ahead, he might finally discover who had traveled through Eldermere during the night, the broken marker as the sun slowly began sinking toward the horizon. Thomas reached a small clearing beside the road. There, he saw something unexpected, a stone marker, half buried in grass. It had fallen sideways long ago, carefully brushing dirt away. Thomas revealed faint carvings on the stone. The letters were old, worn by years of rain and wind, but he could still read them. Pointed toward a place called Ravenport, a name Thomas had never heard before, yet something about it felt familiar. Perhaps it was the same market town Gareth had mentioned, if the stone marker was correct. Ravenport had once been located somewhere beyond the hills, but if that town truly existed, why had no one in Eldermere visited it in generations? The fading light, the sky was beginning to grow darker. Evening shadows stretched across the road. Thomas realized he should return to the village before night fully arrived. But before leaving, he took one last look at the wheel tracks. They continued past the clearing, disappearing deeper into the hills, toward Ravenport, toward the place that might explain why the old road had fallen silent. For a moment, Thomas considered following them even farther, but the valley was already growing. Dim. Night travel through the hills could be dangerous. Reluctantly, he turned around and began walking back toward Eldermere. Yet, as he walked, one thought remained firmly in his mind. Someone had traveled that road. Recently. And whoever they were, they had come from the direction of a town that history seemed to have forgotten. The beginning of a mystery. When Thomas finally reached the village, lanterns were already glowing softly in the windows. Everything looked peaceful, exactly as it always had. But Thomas now knew something the others did not. The old road was not as abandoned as everyone believed. Somewhere beyond the hills, something still existed, something heavy enough to require a large cart and strong horses, something important enough for a traveler to move through the valley silently during the night. And Thomas had a growing feeling that the quiet village of Eldermere was about to become part of a much larger story, one that had been hidden for many years. The next morning arrived slowly in Eldermere. A thin layer of mist rested over the valley, drifting gently above the river and fields. The hills surrounding the village were quiet and still, as if the entire landscape had not yet fully awakened. For most of the villagers, this morning felt no different from any other. Farmers stepped outside to check their crops. Children carried buckets of water from the river, and smoke began rising from chimneys as breakfast fires were lit. But for Thomas Alder, the morning carried a quiet sense of purpose. He had made a decision during the night. Today, he would follow the road beyond the hills, not just for a short walk, but far enough to discover where the wheel tracks truly led. The thought filled him with both curiosity and uncertainty. Few villagers had traveled beyond the hills in many years. The world outside Eldermere had slowly faded into stories and old memories, yet the tracks he had seen were real. Someone had passed through the valley, and Thomas wanted to know why, preparing for the journey before. The sun rose fully above the hills. Thomas prepared for the walk. He packed a small cloth bag with simple supplies, a loaf of bread, small piece of cheese, and a wooden flask filled with fresh river water. His journey would not be long enough to require much more. Still, Thomas understood that traveling beyond the hills meant entering places he had never seen before. The unknown often hides surprises before leaving. He visited the village square. Old Marta was already opening the bakery. When she saw Thomas carrying his bag, she raised an eyebrow. "You were planning to follow the road," she said quietly. It was not a question. Thomas nodded. "Just for a while," he replied. Marta studied him carefully. Then she reached behind the wooden counter and handed him a small lantern. "Hills grow dark quickly in the evening," she said. "Take this." Thomas thanked her. Although Marta rarely spoke about the road, it seemed she understood his curiosity better than most. Leaving Aldermere soon, Thomas began walking toward the edge of the village. The familiar houses slowly disappeared behind him as he reached the old road. Morning sunlight now stretched across the valley, warming the dusty path. The wheel tracks were still visible, clear and steady. They moved confidently toward the hills. As if the traveler who made them had known exactly where they were going. Thomas followed them once again, step by step. The road slowly climbed higher. The grass grew taller here, brushing softly against his legs. Birds moved quietly between branches of old trees. The peaceful sounds of Aldermere faded behind him. Soon the village itself was no longer visible. Only the winding road remained. The silent hills. After nearly an hour of walking, Thomas reached the highest part of the hills. From there he could see far beyond the valley. The landscape stretched endlessly in soft green waves. Small forests appeared in the distance, and farther still, faint shapes of larger hills touched the horizon. For a moment Thomas simply stood there, observing the quiet beauty of the land. It was strange to realize how large the world truly was. For most of his life, Aldermere had felt like the center of everything, yet from this height the village seemed small, almost hidden. Then Thomas noticed something unexpected. Smoke. Very far away, a thin gray line rising slowly into the sky. It was too distant to see clearly, but it looked like the smoke from a fire. Or perhaps a chimney. If someone lived out there, it meant the road might still connect to other places after all. The old bridge. The road began descending on the other side of the hills. As Thomas continued walking, the path became rougher. Small stones and cracks covered the ground. After another half hour, he reached a narrow wooden bridge crossing a shallow stream. The bridge looked extremely old. Several wooden planks were loose. And moss had grown along the edges, yet the structure still stood firmly in place. Thomas crouched near the entrance of the bridge. The wheel tracks passed directly across it. That meant the cart had traveled this way very recently. Slowly, he crossed to the other side. The road continued into a small forest beyond the stream. Tall trees blocked much of the sunlight, creating cool shadows along the path. The air felt quieter here, almost unusually quiet. Even the birds seemed silent. Signs of the past. As Thomas walked deeper into the forest, he began noticing small signs that the road had once been important. Pieces of broken stone markers appeared beside the path. Some looked like they once held directions or distances. Others were too damaged to read. At one point, Thomas found the remains of what looked like an old roadside shelter. The wooden roof had collapsed long ago. The stone foundation remained, perhaps Travelers once rested here during long journeys. These discoveries confirmed something important. The road had once been a true trade. Route.busy, .useful, full of travelers moving between. Towns. Yet now it felt abandoned, frozen. In time, the sound in the distance after several hours of walking. Thomas finally reached the edge of the forest. The trees slowly opened into a wide clearing. Tall grass moved gently in the afternoon wind. And beyond the clearing, the road continued toward something unexpected. Ruins. In the distance, Thomas could see the remains of stone buildings. Broken walls, collapsed roofs, and a tall structure that might once have been a tower. His heart began beating faster. This had to be Ravenport, the market town the villagers had spoken about, but something felt strange. The place looked completely abandoned. No smoke. No movement. No sound. Yet the wheel tracks continued directly toward the ruins. Someone had traveled there. Recently. And for the first time, Thomas realized that his simple curiosity had led him somewhere far more mysterious than he had expected. The edge of Ravenport. The sun slowly began moving toward the horizon. Thomas approached the old town carefully. The stone buildings were covered with vines and moss. Windows stood empty. Wooden doors had fallen from their hinges. It looked as if the town had been abandoned for many decades, perhaps even longer. Yet, the wheel tracks were still visible on the dirt road, leading directly into the center of the ruins. Someone had arrived here not long ago. Thomas stopped at the entrance of the silent town. The wind moved gently through broken streets. Loose stones shifted softly under his boots. Every sound echoed strangely in the empty space. For a moment he wondered if he should turn back, but curiosity pushed him forward. Step by step, Thomas walked into Ravenport. Unaware that the mystery of the old road was only just beginning. The wind moved softly through the empty streets of Ravenport. Tall grass had grown between the cracks of old stone roads. Vines climbed slowly up the walls of buildings that had once been full of life. For many years, perhaps even generations, this town had remained silent. Yet the road leading into Ravenport told a different story. The fresh wheeled tracks Thomas had been following led directly into the center of the abandoned town, which meant someone had come here recently. Someone with a cart, someone carrying something heavy enough to leave deep marks in the road. Thomas stepped forward. Slowly. His boots echoed faintly against the stone beneath him. Each step felt strangely loud in the quiet town. It was the kind of silence that made even the smallest sound noticeable. The creak of a loose wooden shutter, the rustle of grass moving in the wind. The distant call of a crow flying somewhere above the broken rooftops. For a moment, Thomas simply stood there, looking around, trying to imagine what Ravenport must have looked like when it was alive. A town that once lived. Long ago, Ravenport had been an important trading town. The stone streets suggested busy markets once filled with merchants and travelers. Wide roads meant carts and horses had passed through regularly. Large buildings near the center of town likely held shops, inns, and warehouses. Thomas could almost picture it. Merchants unloading barrels of spices, travelers bargaining loudly over prices, children running between crowded stalls, the sound of horses, carts, and voices filling the air. But now, there was nothing, only silence. Time had slowly erased the noise of the past. The old market square following the tracks deeper into the town. Thomas soon reached what appeared to be the central market square. The open space was large and circular. Several broken wooden stalls still stood along the edges, their roofs long collapsed. In the center of the square stood an old stone fountain. Its basin was dry and cracked, yet The carvings along its edges were still visible, symbols of trade and travel. Wheels. Ships. And small car figures carrying sacks of goods. These images told the story of Ravenport's past. This place had once connected many different lands. Merchants had likely come here from distant cities, bringing goods, news, and stories from across the region. But something had caused the town to fall silent, something strong enough to stop an entire trade route. Thomas walked slowly across the square, and then he noticed something important. The wheel tracks turned slightly, leading toward a narrow street beside the fountain. Someone had passed through the market square. Recently. The narrow street. The street the tracks followed was darker than the others. Tall stone buildings stood closely together on both sides. Many of their windows were broken or missing entirely. As Thomas walked forward, he noticed several old signs hanging above doorways. The letters were faded, but some could still be read. One building had once been a blacksmith shop. Another appeared to have been an inn for travelers. And farther down the street stood a large warehouse with thick wooden doors. The doors were slightly open. Thomas stopped. A small breeze pushed the door slowly, causing it to creak softly. The wheel tracks led directly inside. Inside the warehouse. For a moment, Thomas hesitated. The inside of the building was dark. Dust floated through the air where thin sunlight entered through cracks in the walls, but curiosity was stronger than fear. Slowly, Thomas stepped inside. The warehouse was enormous. Long wooden beams stretched across the ceiling. Rows of empty shelves lined the walls. Most of the goods that once filled the building had disappeared long ago. But near the center of the room, something new stood. A cart. A large wooden cart with iron wheels. Thomas walked closer. Carefully, the cart was exactly the same size as the tracks he had followed. Meant this was the cart that had passed through Aldermere during the night, but the cart was empty. Completely empty. No sacks. No crates. No supplies. Nothing. Only a thin layer of dust covering the wooden floor inside the cart. Thomas looked around the warehouse. If someone had brought goods here, where were they now? Strange footprints. As Thomas studied the ground near the cart, he noticed something unusual. Footprints. Several of them. Fresh ones. They moved across the dusty floor toward the back of the warehouse. Thomas followed them slowly. They led to a large wooden door at the rear of the building. Door opened into a narrow alley behind the warehouse, and just beyond that alley, the footprints disappeared into tall grass. Whoever had brought the cart here had clearly left the building afterward, but why leave the cart behind? And why bring an empty cart all the way to a ruined town? The mystery only grew deeper. A sound in the distance just as Thomas stepped back outside. Something unexpected happened. A sound, very faint, but clearly not the wind. It sounded like metal striking stone somewhere far away in the town. Clink. And silence. Thomas froze. He listened carefully. The sound came again. Clink, clink, like someone working with tools somewhere among the ruins of Ravenport. Another person was present, someone who had arrived with the cart, and they were not far away. Thomas felt a sudden mix of excitement and caution. For the first time since entering Ravenport, he realized he was not alone. Somewhere nearby, hidden among the broken buildings and empty streets, a stranger was working quietly in the ruins of the forgotten town. And Thomas had no idea who they were, or what they were searching for. The mystery deepened. The sun was now slowly sinking toward the horizon. Long shadows stretched across the ruined streets of Ravenport. Thomas knew he should probably return to Eldermere before Nightfall dot, but the mysterious sounds continued in the distance. Someone was here. Someone who had traveled through the silent valley, pulling a heavy cart along the abandoned road. And Tomas could not ignore the question that now filled his mind. Could possibly be hidden in the ruins of a forgotten town that would bring a traveler all this way. Taking a slow breath, Tomas stepped carefully into the street again, Dot, and began moving toward the faint sound echoing through the empty town. The quiet streets of Ravenport had remained silent for decades, yet now, somewhere among the crumbling buildings, someone was working. Tomas stood still in the fading afternoon light. The sound came again, as faint metallic clink echoing through the empty town. Clink. Pause. Clinked out. It sounded like a small hammer striking stone. Dot carefully, dot slowly. Dot Tomas moved forward along the narrow street, stepping gently to avoid loose stones that might make noise beneath his boots. The town felt different. Now, Dot not completely abandoned anymore. Somewhere nearby, another person was present, and that person had arrived with a cart. Tomas had discovered inside the warehouse. Dot, following the sound seemed to come from deeper inside Ravenport. Dot, beyond the market square. Past several rows of broken houses, Tomas walked slowly. Streets twisted slightly as they moved, between tall buildings whose upper floors had partially collapsed long ago. Broken wooden beams leaned against stone walls. Pieces of roof tiles lay scattered across the ground. Nature had slowly begun reclaiming the town. Small trees grew from cracks in the streets. Vines wrapped themselves around doorways. Dot, and birds had built nests in the empty windows of old homes. But the fresh footprints Tomas had seen earlier reminded him that someone had walked these streets very recently. Paused again and listened. Dot, clink. Dot, the sound was clearer now. Dot, closer. Dot, just beyond the next corner. Old tower. When Tomas turned the corner, he saw something standing at the end of the street. A tall stone watchtower. Its upper half had partially collapsed, but the lower structure still stood strong. The tower had once likely guarded the entrance to the town, or served as a lookout point for travelers arriving from distant roads. Dot, the metallic sound came from behind it. Dot, Tomas approached carefully. The sun was now low in the sky, casting long shadows across the ruins. Dot, as he moved closer, the sound stopped. The silence returned suddenly. Dot, Tomas stepped around the tower slowly, and there, beside the base of the stone structure, he saw someone. The stranger, a man, knelt beside the tower wall. He wore a dark traveling coat covered with dust from the road. A small lantern rested on the ground beside him. Dot, next to the lantern lay several tools, including a small hammer and chisel. The man appeared to be carefully chipping away at a section of the stone wall. For a moment, Tomas simply watched. Then the stranger noticed him. The man quickly stood up and turned around. Dot, both of them froze. The wind moved softly through the ruins. Neither spoke at first. Dot, finally, the stranger broke the silence. "You should not be here," he said calmly. His voice sounded tired, but not hostile. Dot, Tomas took a step closer. "I followed the road," Tomas replied. "The cart tracks led me here." The stranger studied him carefully. "You are from the valley?" he said after a moment. "From the village." Tomas nodded. "Eldermere." The man looked thoughtful. "I passed through there last night." So it was true. The traveler Tomas had heard in the darkness was standing right in front of him. A curious mission. The stranger seemed surprised that someone from the village had followed him, but after a moment, his expression softened. "I did not expect anyone to notice the cart," he admitted. Tomas glanced toward the tools on the ground. "What are you doing here?" he asked. The stranger hesitated briefly. Then he looked back at the tower wall. "Searching," he said, "for something that has been hidden for a very long time. Thomas looked at the stone surface the man had been working on. At first, it appeared to be an ordinary section of the wall, but then he noticed faint lines carved into the stone, very old. Carvings. Symbols. Almost invisible beneath years of weather and moss. This tower, the stranger explained quietly, is older than the rest of the town. Much older. He brushed dust away from the carved markings. These symbols are directions. Directions to something hidden beneath Ravenport. The hidden story of Ravenporth. Stranger introduced himself as Daniel Harrow, a traveler and historian who studied forgotten places. For years he had been searching for clues about Ravenport. Old documents mentioned that the town once protected something valuable, something hidden underground. But the exact location had been lost when the town was abandoned. Trade route did not disappear by accident. Daniel explained. Something happened here, something that made the merchants leave. Tomas listened carefully. Do you know what it was? He asked. Daniel shook his head slowly. Not yet, but I believe the answer is hidden somewhere beneath this tower. He pointed to the carvings again. They describe an entrance, a hidden passage. Thomas felt a quiet sense of amazement. The silent ruins around them suddenly felt far more mysterious than before. This was no longer just an abandoned town. It was a place hiding secrets from the past. A door in the stone as the last light of the sun faded across the ruins. Daniel returned to his work, using the hammer and chisel carefully. He chipped away at a thin layer of stone. After several minutes, a narrow crack appeared in the tower wall. Daniel pushed gently, and a section of the stone shifted slightly. Dust fell from the edges as the hidden panel slowly moved. Behind it, a dark opening appeared, a doorway carved into the thick foundation of the tower. Cold air drifted quietly from the darkness inside. Thomas held the lantern closer. Stone steps descended into the ground. Staircase. Leading deep beneath Ravenport. For a moment, both men stood silently at the entrance. Wind moved softly across the empty town behind them. This, Daniel said quietly, is what I came here to find. The beginning of the secret night was beginning to settle over the ruins. The sky above Ravenport turned deep blue as the first stars appeared. Thomas looked down the stone staircase, disappearing into darkness. For generations, the people of Eldermere had lived quietly beside the abandoned road. Never knowing that a hidden passage existed beneath the ruined town beyond the hills, a passage that might explain why Ravenport had been abandoned and why the trade route had vanished. Daniel lifted the lantern. The warm light flickered against the stone walls. Well, he said calmly, now we finally discover what Ravenport was hiding. And together, the two men stepped toward the ancient staircase. Night had quietly settled over the ruins of Ravenport. Above the town, the sky had turned deep blue, slowly filling with stars. The wind moved gently through broken streets and empty windows, whispering across the abandoned buildings. But beneath the old watchtower, something long forgotten was about to be discovered. Thomas stood beside Daniel Harrow at the entrance of the hidden doorway. The narrow stone staircase disappeared into darkness below them. Cold air drifted upward from the passage, carrying the faint scent of damp stone and earth. For centuries, no one from Eldermere had likely known this place existed. Yet now the mystery of Ravenport seemed to be opening quietly before them. Daniel lifted the lantern. Its warm yellow light flickered across the stone steps. Well, he said softly, I suppose this is where the real story begins. The descent. The two men carefully stepped onto the staircase. The stone steps were narrow and worn smooth by time, Each footstep echoed softly against the walls as they slowly descended deeper. Underground dust drifted through the lantern light. Cobwebs stretched across the corners of the passage, yet the structure itself remained strong. Whoever had built this hidden staircase had done so with great skill. The walls were carved from large stone blocks, carefully fitted together. Even after so many years, the passage showed almost no signs of collapse. After nearly 20 steps, the staircase curved slightly and continued downward. The air grew cooler, and the sounds of the outside world slowly faded away. Above them, Ravenport remained silent, but beneath the town, a forgotten part of its history waited in darkness. Old carvings as they moved deeper underground. Thomas noticed small carvings appearing along the walls. They were similar to the symbols Daniel had discovered on the tower. Simple shapes, carved into the stone. Wheels, stars, and strange geometric patterns. Daniel paused to examine them. These markings were probably used as guides. He explained quietly. People who worked down here needed a way to navigate the tunnels. Tunnels? Thomas asked. Daniel nodded slowly. If this passage exists, there may be many more. The idea made Thomas glance down the staircase again. The underground world beneath Ravenport might be much larger than they expected. The first chamber, after several minutes of descending, the staircase finally ended. The passage opened into a wide, underground chamber. The lantern light revealed thick stone walls and a high ceiling supported by heavy wooden beams. Dust covered almost everything. But the room itself was surprisingly organized. Along the walls stood rows of old wooden crates and stone shelves. Most were empty now, yet a few still contained broken pottery, rusted tools, and fragments of old cloth. This looks like a storage room, Thomas said. Daniel nodded, possibly for supplies. Or something more valuable? He carefully opened one of the remaining crates. Inside were several small metal coins. Their surfaces were worn, but faint markings were still visible. Daniel lifted one into the lantern light. These are trade coins, he said, very old ones. The discovery confirmed something important. Ravenport had once stored goods beneath the town, perhaps to protect them during dangerous times, but that still did not explain why the town had been abandoned. The underground corridor at the far side of the chamber, another passage continued deeper underground. A long stone corridor stretched into darkness. The floor was smoother here, almost polished, as if many people had walked this path long ago. Daniel raised the lantern higher. This is where things become interesting, he said. The two men began walking slowly down the corridor. Their footsteps echoed softly along the stone walls. The air felt still and ancient, as though the underground passage had remained untouched for many years. Then Thomas noticed something strange. The dust along the floor had been disturbed. Faint marks crossed the corridor. Not footprints. Something else. Something that had been dragged across the ground. Daniel noticed them too. Someone has been here before us, he said quietly. Recently. A hidden door. The corridor eventually ended at a large stone wall. At first it appeared solid, but Daniel stepped closer and ran his hand along the surface. There, he said. A thin line cut across the stone. Almost invisible. It was another hidden door. Daniel searched along the wall carefully until he found a small carved symbol, a circle with a star inside it. He pressed it gently. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deep grinding sound, the stone door slowly shifted open. A cold wave of air rushed from the space beyond. Thomas lifted the lantern. The light revealed something extraordinary. A massive underground room. Far larger than the first chamber. The forgotten vault. The lantern light spread across rows of enormous stone pillars supporting the ceiling. Large wooden crates filled the room. Hundreds of them. Many were broken. Some had collapsed completely with age, but others remained sealed. Daniel walked forward slowly, amazed. This is a vault, he whispered. a trade vault. He opened one of the crates carefully. Inside were long metal bars stacked neatly together. Silver dot another crate contained bundles of cloth wrapped in protective. Wax dot another held dozens of small chests filled with coins. The wealth stored in this underground vault must once have been enormous. But Thomas quickly realized something else. Many of the crates were empty. Their lids broken open. Whatever had been stored here, someone had removed a large portion of it long ago, perhaps during the final days of Ravenport. Or perhaps much later. The true mystery as they explored the vault further. Daniel stopped suddenly. At the far end of the chamber stood a large stone table, spread across. Its surface were several old maps. Their edges had turned yellow with age. Daniel leaned closer. These are trade route maps, he said. They show every road that once connected to Ravenport. Thomas looked carefully. The maps showed roads, stretching in many directions, connecting the town to distant cities and ports, but several of the roads had been crossed out, marked with dark ink as if someone had deliberately ended those routes. Daniel studied the markings quietly. Then he looked at Thomas. I think Ravenport did not disappear because trade ended, he said slowly. I think trade ended because Ravenport disappeared. The thought echoed through the silent vault. Some event in the past had forced the town to abandon its own trade routes. And whatever that event was, it had been serious enough to make an entire town vanish. A discovery still unfinished. The lantern light flickered softly as the two men stood among the forgotten wealth of Ravenport. Above them, the silent ruins of the town rested beneath the stars. But far below, its hidden history was slowly revealing itself. Yet Daniel sensed that this underground vault was only part of the story. The crossed-out trade route suggested something much larger had happened, something that had changed the fate of Ravenport forever. And perhaps that mystery still waited somewhere deeper beneath the town. Daniel closed the map slowly. We've only just begun, he said quietly. And the darkness beyond the vault seemed to agree. Deep beneath the ruins of Ravenport, the lantern light flickered softly against the walls of the ancient vault. The room felt enormous and quiet, supported by tall stone pillars that had stood there for centuries. Dust covered the floor, wooden. Crates sat in long rows, some broken open, others still sealed. And in the center of the room stood the heavy stone table where the old maps had been discovered. Thomas slowly walked around the table, studying the fragile pieces of parchment. The maps were detailed. Roads stretched outward from Ravenport in every direction. Each route ended the town to distant places, cities, ports, and villages that likely once depended on this trade network. Yet several of the roads had been crossed out with thick dark ink as if someone had intentionally erased them. Daniel Harrow carefully rolled one of the maps back into place. There must be records explaining this, he said quietly. A town like Ravenport would have kept documents, ledgers, letters. Thomas looked around the vast underground vault. If they existed, he said slowly, they might still be here. Searching the vault, the two men began exploring the deeper corners of the chamber. Their lantern light moved across shelves, crates and stone alcoves built into the walls. Many of the containers held nothing more than broken pottery or rotted cloth. Time had not been kind to everything stored here, but after several minutes of searching, Thomas noticed a small wooden chest resting on a narrow shelf near the back wall. Unlike the other crates, this one had been carefully sealed. Daniel brushed away the dust. The chest was surprisingly well preserved. Its wood was thick and reinforced with metal bands. On the lid, a faint symbol had been carved. The same circle with a star inside they had seen earlier on the hidden door. Daniel opened it slowly. Inside were several bundles of old parchment, documents carefully folded and tied together with thin cords. Thomas lifted one bundle gently. The paper felt fragile but still readable. These were records. Official records. The forgotten voice of Ravenport itself. The town ledger. Daniel untied the first bundle and spread the pages carefully across the stone table. The handwriting was neat and organized. These appeared to be trade ledgers. Lists of goods arriving and leaving the town. Dates written beside shipments of cloth, silver, grain, spices, and tools. The entries showed that Ravenport had once been extremely active. Dozens of trade carts arrived every week. Ships from distant ports delivered rare goods. Merchants traveled constantly through the valley, but then something strange appeared in the records. The entries suddenly became fewer. Weeks passed between shipments. Then months. And eventually the pages stopped completely. The final ledger entry was written nearly 80 years earlier. After that, the pages were blank. A letter from the past among the documents was a sealed letter. Its wax seal had cracked long ago. Daniel opened it carefully. The writing inside was different from the trade ledgers. More hurried, more personal. It appeared to be written by someone who had once been a leader in Ravenport. Perhaps the town's magistrate. Daniel read the letter slowly while Thomas listened. The message described troubling events happening near the town. Strange rumors had begun spreading among travelers. Several trade routes had suddenly become unsafe. Merchants reported mysterious disappearances along certain roads. Caravans sometimes vanished before reaching the town. At first, the leaders of Ravenport believed the stories were exaggerated. Bandits occasionally attacked travelers on remote roads. But then something more disturbing happened. Entire trade convoys stopped arriving altogether. Not delayed, not robbed. Simply gone, without any explanation. Fear in the town. The letter continued. It described how fear slowly spread through Ravenport. Merchants became cautious. Travelers avoided certain routes. Trade began shifting toward safer towns farther away. Soon, Ravenport's once busy market started growing quiet. The leaders of the town tried to investigate, but the surrounding roads were long and dangerous. Whatever had been happening out there, no one could clearly understand it. Then came the final part of the letter. The writer explained that the town council had made a difficult decision. They would close the trade vault beneath the tower, seal the wealth inside. And encourage the remaining merchants to move their businesses elsewhere. The letter ended with a final sentence written in darker ink. We leave Ravenport tonight, hoping the roads will one day be safe again. The night the town left, Thomas placed the letter gently back onto the table. So they simply left, he said quietly. Daniel nodded. Double quotes, most likely in a single night. The maps with crossed out roads suddenly made more sense. The leaders of Ravenport had tried to mark the dangerous routes, perhaps to warn anyone who might find the records later, but no one ever did. Over time, the town slowly faded from memory. Trade routes shifted to other places. Villages like Eldermere continued living quietly, never knowing why the road had grown silent. One final mystery. As Daniel sorted the remaining documents, he noticed one more piece of parchment hidden at the bottom of the chest. This one looked different. Older. Its edges were rough and worn. The map drawn on it showed Ravenport at the center, but the surrounding roads were not the same as the trade maps. These paths were narrower. Almost secret, and one of them led somewhere unusual. Directly beneath the town itself. Daniel studied the markings carefully. This, he said slowly, is not a trade map. It's a map of tunnels. Thomas looked closer. The lines formed a small underground network branching away from the vault. One tunnel extended farther than the others, deep beneath the hills surrounding Ravenport. Where does it lead? Thomas asked. Daniel traced the path with his finger. Then he looked up to something that the town leaders never mentioned in their records. He pointed to a symbol at the end of the tunnel, strange mark carved beside the final chamber. Not a star, not a wheel, but something older, something that looked almost like a warning. A hidden path still waiting. The lantern light flickered quietly as the two men stared at the underground map. The ruins of Ravenport had already revealed many secrets. A forgotten vault, hidden trade wealth and the records explaining why the town had been abandoned. But now it seemed there was something more. A deeper part of the underground tunnels that the old documents barely mentioned. A place marked only by a mysterious symbol and if the map was correct, the entrance to that tunnel might still exist somewhere beneath the vault. Daniel carefully rolled the parchment closed. "Tomas," he said quietly, "I think Ravenport still has one last secret. And somewhere in the darkness beneath the ancient town, that secret was still waiting." The air in the underground vault had grown cooler as night deepened above Ravenport. Thomas held the lantern close, its warm glow illuminating the edges of the stone walls and the crates of forgotten wealth. Daniel Harrah's eyes traced the faint markings of the newly discovered map, an underground network that had been hidden for centuries. This tunnel, Daniel whispered, was meant to be forgotten. The town's leaders kept it secret even from themselves, or at least from outsiders. Only the map hints it exists. Thomas stepped closer, peering at the lines connecting the vault to an unseen chamber deeper beneath the town. A single symbol marked the end of strange, angular design. Not a wheel, not a star. Something older, more deliberate. "I want to see it," Thomas said quietly. Daniel nodded, carefully rolling the map. Then we follow the tunnel. The entrance, the first challenge, was locating the hidden passage described on the map. Daniel examined the vault walls. For years, no one had noticed the faint cracks along one corner of the room. Thomas reached out and pressed against the stone. There was a subtle give, almost imperceptible, but enough to suggest a secret door. Daniel's lantern illuminated a narrow seam in the wall. He traced it with his fingers and found a small carved indentation matching the symbol on the map. With slow, deliberate pressure, the wall shifted slightly. A faint grinding sound echoed through the vault as the hidden entrance revealed itself, a narrow stone tunnel descending into darkness. The smell was different here. Damp, earthy, and faintly metallic. Thomas adjusted the lantern, its light catching faint scratches along the walls, suggesting others had walked this tunnel before. Perhaps long ago, perhaps recently. Into the darkness, the two men stepped cautiously into the tunnel. The ceiling was low, forcing them to bend slightly. Water had seeped through cracks, creating thin, reflective streams along the stone floor. The air grew colder with every step. Their lanterns revealed occasional piles of rubble, small gaps in the walls, and strange carvings etched deep into the stone. Some of the symbols matched the star circle from the vault. Others were entirely new, ancient patterns. The tunnel twisted and turned. Each bend seemed to stretch farther than the map suggested. Thomas felt a quiet tension in the air, a sense that the place was alive with history, carrying the weight of the town's secrets. After nearly 20 minutes of careful walking, the tunnel began to widen. The first chamber, the tunnel opened into a small chamber. Its walls were damp, lined with moss and faint streaks of minerals. In the center stood a simple stone pedestal. On it rested a small wooden box, weathered with age. Daniel approached it slowly. The town may have left this here as a warning or a record. Thomas knelt beside the pedestal, brushing dust from the box. It had no lock, only a thin carved pattern resembling the symbol at the end of the tunnel on the map. With a deep breath, Daniel lifted the lid. Inside were several scrolls. Unlike the ledger pages in the vault, these were not about trade. These scrolls contained notes, observations, and diagrams describing something far more mysterious. Daniel read aloud one section. "The tunnels connect to a chamber not meant to be disturbed. We hide the vault, we hide the paths. but the heart beneath the town remains. Should it be discovered, those who enter must be cautious. The stone remembers. The earth listens. Thomas felt a shiver run down his spine. This is different, he said softly. It's not just history. It's a warning. Clues in the scrolls. Daniel spread the scrolls across the floor. The diagrams were intricate, underground chambers connected by tunnels, with detailed notes about hidden rooms, storage areas, and structural reinforcements. Some notes mentioned traps, stone slabs that could shift, dropping intruders into lower chambers. Others hinted at hidden compartments holding objects deemed valuable or dangerous. One scroll described a lower chamber as the heart of Ravenport, a room beneath the town's foundation. It was marked as the final destination of a main underground path. Far from the vault, the scrolls explained that the town had been abandoned not just because trade ended, but because the heart was disturbed by unknown forces decades earlier. No records detailed exactly what happened, only that it was too dangerous to confront. A growing sense of caution. Thomas looked at Daniel. So this is why the town was left behind. They weren't afraid of bandits. They were afraid of whatever is down there. Daniel nodded slowly. Exactly. The trade stopped, the town emptied, and the vaults were sealed. But someone still used the road recently, maybe for curiosity or maybe to recover something from the heart. Thomas's mind wandered to the cart he had seen in the warehouse. Could it have been connected to this hidden chamber? And if so, why was it abandoned? The two men paused. The tunnel behind them stretched back to the vault, a safe place. Ahead lay darkness, uncertainty, and the legacy of Ravenport's most mysterious secret. The passage forward, after a brief rest. Daniel lifted the lantern and motioned Tomas forward. The tunnel continued beyond the chamber, narrower and steeper. Water dripped from the ceiling in slow, rhythmic drops. The air was thick with the smell of damp stone and faint minerals. The walls had more carvings now, some resembling protective symbols, others more abstract. Daniel explained that the symbols were intended to guide or warn intruders. Many were carved by the town leaders themselves, designed to preserve the secret while deterring unwanted discovery. As they proceeded, the light from their lantern flickered against shadows that seemed to move on their own. Thomas's footsteps echoed softly in the narrow corridor. He realized that every sound was amplified here, and that every movement might alert something or someone else within the tunnels, approaching the lower chambers. After nearly 30 minutes of careful descent, the tunnel opened slightly. They could see a low stone archway ahead, carved with intricate markings. This marked the entrance to what the scrolls had described as the lower chambers. One step closer to the heart of Ravenport. Daniel paused, looking at the doorway. This is where we must be cautious, he said quietly. The scrolls warn that the next chamber was meant to remain undisturbed. Every step must be deliberate. Thomas took a deep breath. I've come this far. We need to know what's hidden beneath the town. Daniel nodded, and together they stepped toward the archway. Shadows from the lantern danced across the walls. The quiet of the underground world pressing in around them. Beyond the doorway lay the heart of the mystery, the part of Ravenport that had been abandoned, hidden and feared for generations. And as they moved forward, the past of the forgotten town slowly began to reveal itself, one quiet step at a time. The stone archway loomed silently before Thomas and Daniel, marking the threshold to the lower chambers of Ravenport. The air shifted as they stepped through, cooler now, heavier with the weight of the unknown. Every drop of water from the tunnel ceiling seemed louder here, echoing off the walls and into the darkness beyond. Daniel held the lantern high, casting a warm glow across carved stone walls. The marks they had seen earlier continued here, symbols and warnings etched meticulously by the town's ancient leaders. This is it, Daniel whispered. The chamber the scrolls warned about, they called it the Heart of Ravenport. The chamber no one returned from. Thomas swallowed hard. Why would they leave a warning like this? If it's so dangerous, why map it at all? Daniel studied the carvings on the archway. Perhaps they hoped someone might understand it one day, or perhaps they simply wanted to document what had happened. They knew the town might be forgotten, but the secret had to survive. Entering the heart, the chamber beyond the archway was enormous. The lantern's light barely reached the far corners, revealing high ceilings held up by massive stone pillars. Shadows stretched like silent fingers across the walls. The floor was uneven, carved from a single slab of stone worn smooth in places. Strange patterns were etched across its surface, faintly visible in the flickering light, concentric circles, spirals, and angular symbols that Thomas could not recognize. Daniel stepped forward carefully. This room, it was more than a vault or a storage area. It was something sacred or dangerous. Perhaps both. Thomas's eyes moved over the room. Scattered around were remnants of crates and chests, but many had been emptied long ago. Broken pottery lay scattered, and faint traces of dust suggested the chamber had not been fully undisturbed. Then, at the center of the room, they saw it, a large stone dais, slightly raised above the floor. On it rested a covered object, its shape obscured by a thick layer of cloth. Something had been intentionally hidden here. Daniel approached it slowly, brushing away the dust. The heart, he whispered. Whatever the town wanted to protect, it was here. The covered secret. Thomas stepped closer, heart pounding in the quiet. The cloth was heavy, woven tightly, and faded from age. He reached out cautiously and brushed it aside. Beneath it lay a small chest, unlike any other they had seen. The wood was dark and polished, surprisingly well preserved despite the centuries. The metal bindings gleamed faintly in the lantern light. Daniel knelt beside it. This is what they feared. What forced the town to abandon everything? The vaults, the tunnels, the entire town. And yet, they didn't destroy it. They hid it. Thomas's hands trembled as he reached for the chest. The air in the chamber seemed to thicken, heavy with centuries of secrecy. Outside, Ravenport slept in silence. Below, in the heart, time itself felt suspended. With a slow, deliberate motion. Daniel lifted the lid, the chest's contents inside. The chest were objects unlike anything Thomas had expected. Bundles of papers, faded and brittle, lay alongside small vials of unknown substances. Symbols were etched onto the vials' surfaces, resembling some of the carvings in the tunnels. Small figurines, carved from stone and ivory, were arranged carefully. And at the very center, a small metallic object pulsed faintly with a golden glow, almost imperceptible but undeniably present. Daniel examined the papers first. Ancient scripts, diagrams, and careful notes documented the town's efforts to safeguard something powerful, something they did not fully understand themselves. The heart, Daniel said quietly, was not just a vault. It was a repository of knowledge, of objects, perhaps even forces they could not control. Thomas looked at the glowing object. What is that? Daniel shook his head. Even they didn't know for sure. They only knew it had to be hidden, protected. And when the danger became too great, the town left, sealing everything underground. Understanding the danger, the scrolls hinted at experiments, objects and records meant to preserve both knowledge and warnings. The town leaders had been scholars, merchants, and guardians. They had amassed wealth and trade. Yes, but they had also encountered something beyond their understanding. The metallic object at the center of the chest seemed alive in its stillness. Its glow pulsed in time with Thomas's heartbeat. He felt a strange warmth emanate from it, Yet at the same time, a chill ran down his spine. Daniel traced the carvings on the chest. Every symbol, every tunnel, every mark in the vaults. It was all meant to contain this. The heart of Ravenport is not a single item. It is a network of knowledge, artifacts, and perhaps even power. Something the townspeople feared could unravel their entire world if mishandled. Thomas looked at the chest again. The centuries of secrecy, the abandoned town, the empty streets of Ravenport, all of it now made sense. The town had not failed because of trade or bandits. Ravenport had left to survive, to contain the secret below. The weight of discovery. The two men remained silent in the chamber for a long moment. The weight of history pressed on them. Finally, Daniel said quietly, "We have discovered what no one has touched for decades. But we must tread carefully. This chamber, this heart, it is dangerous. The records alone warn us not to disturb it unnecessarily." Thomas nodded slowly. "I understand. But the cart in the warehouse? Someone brought it here recently. Could they have tried to take something from the heart?" Daniel's eyes darkened. Perhaps. Or perhaps they were drawn by curiosity, the same way we were. But every warning in these scrolls is clear. The heart is not meant to be removed or tampered with. The town abandoned their home to keep it safe. We cannot make the same mistake. Thomas stepped back, letting the lantern light dance across the stone dais and the glowing object. The chamber was quiet, timeless, suspended in its own secret world beneath the ruins. For a moment, both men simply stood there, absorbing the gravity of what they had found. The heart of Ravenport. The chamber no one returned from, and centuries of silence finally had begun to tell its story. The heart of Ravenport lay silently beneath the ruins. Its stone walls, absorbing centuries of dust and shadow. Thomas and Daniel remained in the chamber, the lantern light flickering softly against the carved pillars and the objects on the stone dais. The metallic artifact in the center pulsed faintly, as if keeping time with the heartbeat of the underground vault itself. Daniel carefully examined the scrolls again. The heart, he whispered, was more than a repository. It was a safeguard. The town kept knowledge, relics, and forces here. Forces they feared might escape if left unchecked. Thomas's eyes lingered on the small glowing object at the chest center. "Forces?" he asked softly. "Like magic?" Daniel shook his head slowly. "Not magic. Knowledge. Objects, mechanisms, substances. Things that could alter the town's fate or the course of trade and power in the region. They were misunderstood, dangerous, and the town decided to hide it. Beneath Ravenport, the arrangement of the heart, the two men studied the dais and surrounding artifacts carefully. Small vials contained powders and liquids of unknown origin, each labeled with symbols carved in fading ink. Several small figurines, carved from stone and ivory, were arranged deliberately in concentric patterns around the glowing object. It seemed ceremonial, yet practical. A system designed to contain, protect, and perhaps warn. Daniel traced the carvings on the stone. "Every arrangement matters," he said. The townspeople believed that even the placement of each artifact contributed to keeping the heart stable. Disturb it incorrectly, and the entire system could fail. Thomas nodded slowly. "So this is why they left. Not because the town was failing, but because they could not control what they had discovered." Daniel's voice was quiet. "Exactly. They preserved knowledge of the cost of their homes, their markets, and their lives in the town above." The scroll's clues. Daniel turned back to the scrolls, spreading them carefully across the stone table. One document in particular caught Thomas's attention. It detailed a process. A ritual of sorts. Not magical, but methodical. Each step described moving artifacts, positioning symbols, unsealing chambers with precise engineering. The heart, Daniel said, was active in its own way. The town's leaders had to maintain it. Their instructions ensured that the vault, the tunnels, and the chamber above all remained in balance. A misstep could be catastrophic. That is why Ravenport was abandoned. They could not risk a mistake. Thomas studied the glowing object again. It's alive in a sense, he whispered. Not alive like people, but it reacts, feels. Daniel nodded. Yes, the artifact at the center is connected to everything else. Its energy, its presence, stabilizes the heart. That is why it was central to their design. They hid it, yes, but they also made sure it could not be removed easily. A cautious approach, the two men carefully examined the surrounding vials and figurines. Each item had a purpose. Some seemed to protect the glowing object. Others seemed to measure the environment of the chamber. Daniel spoke quietly. We must not disturb this. Not recklessly. One wrong move could damage the system, or worse, trigger the dangers the town feared. Thomas felt the weight of responsibility pressing down. It's incredible, he said softly. All this knowledge, all this effort, hidden beneath the town, and no one above knows it exists. Daniel nodded. Centuries of secrecy, and now, we are the first outsiders to step into this chamber in generations. We must tread carefully. Every action matters. Understanding the heart, Daniel pointed to the metallic object again. The heart is a focal point. Everything in this chamber revolves around it. The scrolls describe tests, observations, and instructions for maintaining balance. Misalignment could destabilize not just this chamber, but the tunnels above and potentially the structure of the town itself. Thomas felt a chill as he looked around. The walls seemed to lean slightly with the weight of centuries. The silence of the chamber was oppressive yet mesmerizing. Daniel continued. The townspeople were scholars, artisans, and guardians. They understood some of the heart's power, but not all. They acted out of caution, wisdom, and fear. Their solution: abandon Ravenport and seal its secrets underground. A whisper of the past as the men examined the artifacts. Thomas felt a strange sensation, as if the chamber itself was aware of their presence. The metallic object pulsed faintly, not in rhythm with the lantern light, but with something older, slower. A heartbeat of its own. Daniel noticed it too. The artifact reacts to life, to movement, to thought, he said softly. It is not conscious in the way we understand, but it senses presence. That is why it was protected so carefully. Any disturbance could be dangerous. Thomas glanced at the surrounding scrolls. One note mentioned the eyes of the heart, suggesting the artifact monitored conditions in the chamber, the tunnels, and even above ground. This is remarkable, Thomas whispered. The town created a living system, a hidden network beneath their streets, and they left it for centuries, trusting no one else. Daniel nodded. Yes, and now we are here. We have to respect it. Preparing to explore further, Daniel carefully resecured the scrolls and moved to the chest, closing it gently. The glowing object pulsed softly in response, as if acknowledging their caution. Thomas stepped back, studying the tunnels beyond the chamber. The scrolls had hinted that the heart connected to deeper paths, some possibly leading to unexplored sections of Ravenport's underground network. We can't disturb the heart, Thomas said. But maybe we can explore what lies beyond without triggering anything. Daniel agreed. Slowly, carefully, every step must be deliberate. The heart is the key, but the paths beyond may contain additional secrets, records, artifacts, or knowledge lost to time. Thomas felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. Every step into the tunnels carried the weight of centuries of history, secrecy, and the caution of a town that had left its home to protect the unknown. Moving beyond the heart, the two men prepared to continue. Lantern in hand, Daniel led the way to the tunnel beyond the chamber. The walls were lined with more carvings, some unfamiliar, some repeated symbols of protection. The tunnel narrowed and descended, dark and silent. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling. The air felt heavier here, almost alive with the accumulated centuries of secrecy. Thomas followed closely, every step echoing softly against the stone. The glow from the heart faded behind them, yet its influence lingered, a sense of vigilance, of something watching, of a balance maintained across time. Daniel paused at a fork in the tunnel, consulting the scrolls. One path led deeper, descending sharply. The other curved slightly upward, hinting at a connection to unknown chambers. The scrolls mention both, he said. One path leads to more records, perhaps even explanations. The other, deeper mysteries. Either way, we proceed with caution. This is not a simple tunnel. It is the continuation of Ravenport's secret. Thomas nodded. Every nerve in his body was alert, yet a calm focus settled over him. They were about to uncover the next layer of history, a layer untouched for centuries, a layer that could finally answer why Ravenport had been abandoned, and what it had tried so desperately to protect. The lantern light flickered. Shadows danced along the stone walls, and the journey into the unknown depths continued.